Hello and welcome to this lecture, which is dedicated to the first 100 years of the history of the University of Malta. My name is Emanuel Buttigieg. I'm a senior lecturer in early modern history.
Hello, I am Simone Azzopardi, an assistant lecturer in contemporary history. We are both members of the Department of History at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Malta. This lecture is being held in collaboration with the Malta Historical Society.
We are now in the reading room of the National Library of Malta because in this place are found many of the documents that are effectively the foundation documents of the University of Malta. The origins of our university go back to 1592, when the Jesuit College of Malta was opened in Valletta, just a stone throw away from where we are at the moment. It was known as the Collegium Melitense. However, it was in 1769 that what one can call the actual and proper setup of a modern university started to come into being. Now, the beginning of the story is quite dramatic and exciting. So, on the 22nd of April, 1768, the very early hours of the morning, a troop of soldiers surrounded the Jesuit College, and they effectively placed its occupants, the Jesuits, under house arrest. They were then herded into the office of the rector of the Jesuit College to hear what the Advocate General had come to tell them. Now, the Advocate General had a message from the Grand Master Pinto, basically outlining why they were being asked to leave the island and what was going to happen. And this is what it said. Since we, that's referring of course to the Grand Master, and our religion, that's how they refer to the order, have been vested with sovereignty over these islands by the magnificence of the Crown of Sicily, and with the agreement of the sovereigns of Europe, and since it has pleased His Majesty the King of the Two Sicilies to inform us that he had expelled from his reign, because of serious crimes against the state, all the members of the Society of Jesus, we, feeling bound to observe the agreements referred to above, have determined to expel from our dominion the individuals belonging to the said society. That's a translation from the original document, and it tells us that what was happening here was basically a reflection of what was happening elsewhere in Europe. There had been for a couple of years a wave of anti-Jesuit sentiment for a whole variety of reasons, and that ultimately saw a reflection here in Malta as well. Within a few days, the Jesuits, under cover of darkness, were placed on a vessel and they sailed away, thus bringing to an end a relationship that had lasted for about 170 years. So what was going to happen at that point? Well, the Grand Master now had to seek papal permission to be able to dispose of the assets of the Jesuits. That's of course because the Jesuits were a religious order, and the order itself, the Order of Malta, was a religious order. So they needed papal permission to be able to get their hands on these possessions. But also, since Pinto had already been thinking that he might create a university out of the situation, traditionally, if you wanted to establish a university, you needed to have either papal permission or imperial permission. And so in this case, the Grand Master was seeking papal permission to establish the university on these islands. So we find a very extensive and intensive correspondence between Malta and Rome happening in those months. And ultimately out of that would come the documents that really create this institution. The first of these two documents were papal briefs issued by Pope Clement XIV on the 20th of October 1769. And we refer to them with their Latin names, if we can call it that, One is called Sedula Romani Pontificis, and the other one Solliciti Nos Quidem. So this was the beginning of the whole operation. Pinto then proceeded through his council, which was the government of the order and the government of Malta effectively, to issue the foundation decree on the 22nd of November 1769, and it's also referred to by its Latin title, Erectio Collegi et Universitati Studiorum Melitensi. That's quite a detailed document. I'd just like to quote the opening part of it because it's poetic, but also captures the spirit of the time. So from this moment, we establish in this college a public university of general studies. We grant to the same university, to its directors, lecturers, masters, and scholars, all the privileges, prerogatives, preeminences, graces, and honors as are granted to all public universities. And it is our will that they should be enjoyed and used as if they were specially expressed herein. For the better management of the said college and university, we hereby create the post of protector, whom we shall in due course nominate, and who, in our place and under our orders, shall have all authority and direction. And we invest him with the powers to confer degrees of bachelor, licentiate, doctor, and master, on such as shall have pursued their studies during the prescribed periods. So here you have an essential point, the fact that the University of Malta from the beginning was conceived as a state university, meaning therefore that the government of the day would have the prerogative to choose the rector of the institution, a tradition that of course has continued down to the very present. A further two papal documents followed, also referred to by their Latin titles, Dudum Nos per alias and Maxima Utilitas. These were dated 26 January 1771 and essentially put the final touches, if you want, to the administrative framework that was needed and through which the Grand Master's authority within the university structure was effectively put into place and strengthened. Now, Pinto used the authority that was vested in him to choose the first protector, what we today would call a chancellor of the university, and he chose a colleague of his, Fraguedes, as the first protector of the university. And Pinto also took the critical decision to find the first rector. And of course, finding the right man for that job was going to be very critical. And the choice fell on a very able Tuscan clergyman called Roberto Ranieri Costaguti. Some who had been to Malta, in fact, before, so Pinto was familiar with him. And the machinery was put into motion, letters were sent out, and Costaguti accepted to come over and be the first rector of this university. He in fact reached Malta in February 1771 with two colleagues. He didn't come alone, and he started a recruitment drive effectively so that he could choose the rest of the academic staff of the university. One of his first tasks was to draw up what they called the constitutions of the university, in other words, the rules and regulations. And these deal with everything. They're quite massive. Anything from when the students have to go to prayers, what they can eat, how they're going to dress and live, and so on. So the constitutions also speak about how discipline should be dealt with. And even the smallest misdemeanor had to be reported to the rector because, and this is what the constitution said, if the hand is not firm against the drop of water trickling through the roof, that which at first is a drop becomes a torrent of water, which leads to the total collapse of the said roof. So it's poetic, but it's also ominous. You know, he's saying, if you're not firm with these students, they will get carried away. So we have to be firm from the beginning. Now, the initial setup, together with other additions that came to the university meant that by the end of 1771, the University of Malta consisted of 3 faculties, which were theology, jurisprudence, and medicine. This last one, medicine, actually knew its origins all the way back to 1676 as the School of Anatomy and Surgery. But now this became incorporated into the university as the Faculty of Medicine. There was also a college for the pages of the Grand Masters and a navigation school, which were separate but were also incorporated into the university. And what had previously been the Jesuit College was also made part of the university. So what you have is actually quite a complex structure from the very beginning. One in which a subject upon which a lot of emphasis was placed was the teaching of mathematics. And this is understandable because the order, as a military and naval institution, put a lot of emphasis on mathematics as a discipline that was useful to its military and naval endeavors. How do you define a university? This is controversial, there are different ways of looking at it, but essentially if we look at the University of Malta, what you have is a papal chartered institution which has academic staff which is salaried by the state. That's of course the order at this time. It teaches a number of disciplines: law, medicine, arts, theology, as well as subjects like navigation, as well as having sort of the equivalent of a kind of sixth form, if you want, attached to it. So in all of these senses, by 1771, you have a very holistic institution in place in the heart of Valletta that is going to be running the educational establishment and has the authority to award degrees. And that is a fundamental concept here. Now, not everyone on the island, and that included Knights and Maltese, were satisfied or enthusiastic about these measures. We know that there were critics of Costa Guti as well as of the university itself. Why were there these reservations? There probably were different reasons. There must have been those who still resented the expulsion of the Jesuits. There were those who felt that Costa Guti and his colleagues had received too many privileges from the Grand Master, and probably also some issues of personal jealousies that were at play. We're quite fortunate that we can follow some of these feelings of antipathy through a diary that was written by a chaplain of the Order of St. John. He was very likely Maltese, although we're not quite certain about his identity. But he was a cleric, a priest of the order, and among the different things he wrote about in his diary were his rather negative reflections about the university. So, for example, on the 23rd of October 1771, he noted with distaste, you can really feel it in his writing, how what had been the oratory in the former Jesuit church, which was now the university church, the oratory was turned into the premises for the nautical school. They removed the seats and they put in this big model of a ship, of a galley or a vessel, and was being used for the training of those who were studying navigation. And as I said, the diarist felt this was a profanation, and he blamed the director for this very despicable behavior, which he said others also shared. Now, in 1773, Pinto died. He had been, remember, the founder of the university, so its greatest champion, and he was succeeded as Grand Master by Jimenez. Jimenez found that the financial situation of the order in Malta was in dire straits, and among other measures, he felt that he should retrench on the expenses of the university. He said he didn't want to impact the students, and the workings of the university, but the economic situation was such that he had to do something. The most significant measure that Jimenez took was to expel Rector Costaguti and all the foreign teaching staff. They were made to leave. They were replaced by local Maltese academics and scholars, which Jimenez argued were equally capable, but would cost him less than the foreign staff to actually pay. Our diarist again noted these happenings, and he has two short entries where somehow you can feel the sense of satisfaction almost that he's feeling at this turn of events. And in one he says, the eviction of the masters from the college, and the other one, the university is removed. Quite ominous as well. Now, the fortunes of the university would be revived, fortunately, quite quickly, because Jimenez died in 1775 and was replaced as Grand Master by de Rawan, very much seen as a figure who was influenced by the Enlightenment ideas of the time. In 1776, Rawan summoned a Chapter General of the Order. This was the highest legislative body within the order, and one of the measures taken by the Chapter General was to give a new lease of life to the university. So effectively the university is reborn in this moment. Once again, there is a lot of emphasis that this university should have a good class of mathematics so that it can reach the needs of the order. On 22nd April 1779, Rawan took another critical step when he granted the university a level of financial autonomy. And as we know, even down to the present, this continues to be a significant issue for the university, its financial position within wider society. With regards to the teaching staff, Rawan was determined to have dynamic, progressive, forward-looking individuals, which he did. And we know that their ideas were such that the inquisitor, the local sort of religious policeman, often was critical of these choices. So, you can see these different currents, as ever, in a university clashing, the more progressive views with the more conservative views. In 1780, there's a book on arithmetic published, which was dedicated to Grandmaster Rawan, and interestingly, the author of the book went so far as to claim that Rawan was the founder of the university. Of course, he wasn't, but in those circumstances where the university had almost died out and now was back and was thriving, there was this image of Rawan having effectively given this new lease of life to the institution. Of course, the wider world was changing. In Paris, in July 1789, a crowd of people attacked the royal fortress of the Bastille. We consider this as the classic starting point of the French Revolution. And as ever, Malta felt the reverberations of these wider happenings. 10 years later, June 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte reached these shores and very swiftly dispatched the Knights of Malta out and took over these islands. Now, on the 18th of June 1798, Napoleon issued a series of instructions on the subject of education on these islands. The university was shut down, and in its place was established an École Centrale, very much on the model that was developed in France itself. This École Centrale was to teach a range of subjects which were, in a sense, of a more scientific kind of orientation. There was also to be an overhaul of the whole educational system with primary schools across the island and other such measures. Now, this is understandable. From the point of view of someone like Napoleon, there was no point in having a small university on a small island. What he was after was an empire. And what does an empire need? It needs people who are trained in what that empire is going to need. So what we're seeing happening in Malta was reflective of this current of thought. What also was changing with these measures was that, under the Knights, the educational system, such as it was very decentralized. Napoleon's measures envisaged a much more centralized, state-controlled system, from primary level all the way to the highest level, the École Centrale. They were all very laudable ideas, but most of them would remain just ideas, because on the 2nd of September 1798 began the anti-French riots. The French that were in Valletta and the harbour towns locked themselves up in the cities. On land, they were blockaded by the Maltese insurgents. At sea, they were blockaded by the Portuguese and the British. So as you can imagine, in a war-like situation, there wasn't much room for thinking about these educational reforms. However, we do know that there was some effort to keep the École Centrale operating in the last months of 1798, but ultimately that had to shut down and wait, like much else, until hostilities would come to an end. Now, among the victims of those turbulent few months that we tend to call the French period was a lecturer of the university. We tend to know him as Dumbekil Cherry. He had been a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Malta. He was involved in a plot to try to oust the French authorities from the harbour towns. That plot failed, and he was executed by firing squad for his role in that event. And thus, for the moment, the story of the university had to pause there.
We shall now continue the account about the University of Malta from the Valletta campus, which served as the traditional seat of the university. Malta was not yet an official British colony when, in October 1800, following the stint of inactivity in the context of the French interlude, Alexander Ball, who was the British captain at the time, reinstituted the University of Malta. He appointed Canon Francesco Saverio Caruana as rector. A point of continuity was thus ascertained. Just as in the orders period, the appointment of the rector rested with the central government, the British government was subsequently in charge. As much as the Catholic element was pervasive in this institution, not least through the series of clergymen that were appointed in the positions of rectors and eventually as directors of education, the Church did not have an absolute sway over the institution. Some secular components do emerge. The case of Dr. Cleardo Naudi, though quite isolated, is very telling in this sense. Dr. Naudi, one of the first Maltese to convert to Protestantism, although later on he was to reconvert to Catholicism, was a professor of chemistry. In his opening ceremony oration of 1806, he stressed his intentions to improve the position of the sciences, while adding that for these to be useful, they should have the purpose of improving the conditions of man, who is the principal lord of the earth that we inhabit. Naudi was one of the few Maltese who comprised an overlap between the British Protestant missionaries and the university, owing to his contribution to the translation of the scriptural text. This overlap is also apparent in the appointment of Michel Anton Vasali as first professor of Maltese in 1825. His appointment followed the Protestant missionaries' acknowledgement of Vasali's potential to translate the Bible into Maltese. His position, which was not publicly funded, was short-lived, however. So too was the Protestant missionaries' efforts to evangelize the Maltese. And yet, when in 1825 the University Council sought to reinstate the requirement that members of staff at the university be vouched Catholics, following expressed fears of Maltese parents that their sons might risk losing their religion, the British authorities did not oblige. Intellectual curiosity was certainly being fostered. Indeed, scholarly erudition was not limited to what one could get from within the university alone. Close by the university, there was a bookshop whose inventory for 1815 spares us some details about the reading needs of those intellectually curious enough to purchase such works as the plays and the poetry of Tobias George Smollett. As much as reading, it seems a lot of writing was being done too. The shop, it is noted, stocked 24,000 pens of good quality. Quite unconventional in these early years of the 19th century was the program of evening classes in painting, where students worked from live nude models. This incurred extra expenses for the oil to light the lamps after dark and to hire the men, and men only, serving as models. But the nude features more strikingly in the Maltese gypsothèque, made up of plaster casts of Greek antiques. This collection, purchased sometime after 1870 by the university, was used for purposes of education in history of art, archaeology, and the classics. The Greek classical element, as it were, had already featured for a long time at university, as evident in the more modest portico which had been added to the entrance on St. Paul Street in the early 1820s. Beyond the neoclassical style of the portico, on which the royal coat of arms sits, curiously enough, the inscription is in Greek. As against to Latin, reading, learning is the gateway to honor. Yet the university's experience was not always very honorable. When the 1836 Commission undertook an inquiry, the institution was found lacking on so many levels. Judge Ignazio Gavino Bonavita would follow up the criticism with the Statuto Fondamentale. Among other things, he proposed that lectures should no longer be read out, but should take the form of a discussion, that these should be 1 hour and a half long, with the first hour being used for instruction and the last half hour being used for revision. He also proposed that exams should be part written and part oral. Several of these recommendations, however, were largely scrapped. By the time the next Royal Commission would look into university affairs in the late 19th century, much was found to be desired still. Further attempts for improvements were stalled in an institution where time ticked away rather slowly. In the early 1840s, Rector Reverend Thaddeus O'Malley, a liberal Irish ecclesiastical and a politician as well, had been assigned the task of compiling a project of studies, the Progetto, after the council had entered into a rut and change was imminent. O'Malley's plan for reform was quite forward-looking and groundbreaking. For instance, in the case of medicine and surgery, he proposed the need for clinical and practical training, noting also that qualifications should be awarded after an additional 3-year stint of practice and clinical training in the several departments at the hospital. Another of his suggestions, which was frowned upon, was that women should be allowed to follow a course in obstetrics. Half a century would have to pass before this change would be effected. Meanwhile, in 1853, a certain Mr. Charles or Carlo Rapinet wrote to the governor to apply for a post at the office of the Comptroller of Contracts. His application was accompanied by a certificate of due diligence issued by Rector William Henry Bott, reading as follows. This is to certify that diligence and progress of Mr. Carlo Rapinet appear, by the testimony of the several instructors whose classes he had attended, namely of English, Italian, algebra, history and geography, arithmetic and writing, to have been always satisfactory and deserving of approbation. This casts light on the job prospects which an 18-year-old who speaks the English and Italian languages had in mid-19th century Malta. This letter also captures the reality of a linguistic dichotomy, which, though dormant in the mid-19th century, was soon to flare up in the 1870s and 1880s and thereafter, featuring a strain between Italian and English. In the late 1870s, another commission found a particular and to them unacceptable situation where Italian still prevailed, and this not only in the government departments but also at the university. Italian still ruled. That university politics and praxis would sooner or later be drawn into the language debate would become inevitable. In the meantime, Rapinette did get the job. The coexistence which still reigned in the mid-19th century between these two elements, the British and the Italian on island Malta, is significantly captured in the seal and motto used by the university at that time, featuring in the same certificate. In the middle is a figure probably denoting Melita, the national personification of Malta as a woman. She has attributes that recall Athena or Minerva, goddess of wisdom. One hand lies on the top part of her round shield, resting on the ground, and at her foot, on her right, sits an owl. The motto in Latin reads, Universitas Melitensis Literarum Altrix Favente Britannia, translating to the University of Malta, nourisher of letter, under the tutelage of Britain. This seal and motto remained in use until replaced by the current one, designed by Rector Themis Mead in 1922.
To conclude this brief overview of the first 100 years of the university, we'd like to share a short quotation by a young Scotsman by the name of Charles William Paisley, who was here in 1802-03. And he said he was very impressed by the level of mathematics taught at the University of Malta. In his own words, a most laudable institution, great for so small an island, but circumscribed for want of instruments. And in many ways, the challenges that Paisley identified in the early 19th century are still the challenges that we face in the early 21st. There is always this difficulty between the balance between research and other priorities. And so it continues throughout the history of the university, not just in these first 100 years that we've explored, but also in more recent times.
There's of course more to be said about the history of the university, both chronologically and thematically. As the University of Malta marked its 250th anniversary in 2019, and this in the midst of a pandemic too, we were reminded more than ever that this is the story of an institution, but also of its staff and its members and students, the men and women who were formed by the university, but also left some kind of impact on it. Thank you.